It's the silence I remember most. They didn't shout my name from the rooftops. They whispered it in rooms I was no longer allowed to enter. They gave me until dawn. It sounds like a kindness, doesn't it? A few hours to get your affairs in order. It wasn't. It wasn't an execution. It was an erasure. And that, I've learned, is so much worse. For 12 years, my name was Ceres Althea, and my function was memory. I wasn't a politician. I didn't have a title that came with land or a seat on the High Council. My power was quieter than that. I was the one who managed the deep archives, the histories, the census data, the original charters for every guild, and the minutes from every decree ratification for the last 200 years. I knew where the money went. I knew why a law was passed, not just what it said. I knew the promises the emperor's grandfather had made to the river merchants, and I knew the ones his father had broken. This knowledge made me useful. Men and women of influence would seek me out. They wouldn't summon me to the palace. That would be too public. They would send a quiet message, and we would meet in a dusty records room. They'd ask me about precedent, about the forgotten clauses in old trade agreements, about whether a new grain tax was truly for a famine reserve or if it was to fund a military expansion on the western border. I never gave them my opinion. I never had one, not officially. I just gave them the facts. I would show them the ledgers, the maps, the signed testimonies, and then I would let them draw their own conclusions. This made me respected in certain circles. It made me a quiet, inconvenient truth in others. I thought the emperor understood my role. I thought he saw me as a balancing agent, a check on the ambitions of his court. I believed he valued the truth I guarded. I was wrong. He didn't value it, he feared it. The decree came at dusk. One lone imperial messenger. He was young, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. He didn't speak a word. He just held out the official scroll. The emperor's seal, a stark crimson wax, was unbroken. I took it. He turned and walked away. He never made eye contact. I unrolled it. The script was formal, elegant. The words were calm. Ceres Althea is to depart the capital grounds before the first light of dawn. It was a simple sentence, but the ones that followed were the real message. I was forbidden from addressing the court, forbidden from appealing to any magistrate or council, forbidden from seeking an audience with the emperor himself. The order was non-negotiable. It was absolute. I knew what it meant. Everyone in the capital knew what an order like this meant. This wasn't an honorable exile. This wasn't a reassignment to a distant province. This was a cleansing. You are ordered to leave before dawn when you are a plague, something to be cut out of the body politic before the infection can spread. It meant you were already politically dead. The journey out of the city was just a formality, a funeral procession for one. I stood there for a long time, just holding the scroll. The city I had served my whole life had just pronounced me dead, and the sun was going down. The first thing I did was try to access the archives from my personal terminal. Access denied. My credentials, the ones I had held for over a decade, were gone. Just like that. My name was no longer in the system. My work, the thousands of documents I had cross-referenced, the historical timelines I had built, all of it was behind a wall I could no longer see over. They didn't just lock the door. They pretended I never had a key. That was the first wave of the erasure. The silence. The immediate, deafening silence where my authority used to be. I left my office and walked back to my residence. The two Imperial guards who were always posted at the end of my street were still there, but something was different. their posture, their gaze. They weren't looking out, protecting the street from threats. They were looking in, at my building, at me. They weren't my protectors anymore. They were my wardens. I went inside. My 2 servants were there, tidying things that were already tidy. They moved around me with a strange, careful grace. They wouldn't meet my eyes. When they spoke to each other, it was in hushed tones, as if there had been a death in the house. There had been. Mine. I asked my aide, a bright young man named Kyle, whom I had been training, to send a message, a simple note to a friend on the Trade Council. He just stood there for a moment, looking at the floor. Then he told me that the Imperial courier service was not available to me. Not unavailable for the evening. Unavailable to me. That was the moment the walls truly went up. Not the physical walls of the city, but the invisible ones. The ones made of fear. No one was coming to help. No one would dare. My allies were not allies. They were just people who had benefited from my work. And now I was a liability. They were choosing to survive. I couldn't blame them. I had hours, maybe 6, maybe 7. I had to pack. What do you pack when you're being erased? A few clothes, some money. It all felt pointless, but I couldn't just walk away. There was one last thing. It wasn't for me. It was for the work, the part of the truth that lived outside the official archives. I kept a private ledger. It held the notes that connected the official documents, the names of people who had given anonymous testimony, the unofficial reasons for official decisions. It was the key to everything, the one thing that proved the history they were trying to bury. It was hidden, not in my home. That would have been the first place they'd look. It was tucked inside the binding of a massive, forgotten book of provincial maps in the Great Library. A book no one had requested in a century. I had to get it. I had to walk through the capital one last time. The air was getting cooler. The streets were still busy with people finishing their day. I walked past the aqueduct I had helped plan, using ancient water flow records to prove it was viable. I walked past the market square where my census data had helped rationalize the trade fees, lowering them for the small farmers. I felt like a ghost haunting the scenes of my own life. People I knew saw me. A merchant I'd advised on guild charters, a clerk from the Ministry of Structures, even a junior minister I had spoken with just last week. I saw the flicker of recognition in their eyes, the beginning of a nod, a smile, and then I saw it vanish. They would look away, suddenly find something interesting in a shop window, turn to a companion and start talking with an urgent, false animation. Their fear was a physical thing. It was so much louder than any greeting could have been. They didn't hate me. They were terrified of me, terrified of what I now represented. Contagion. I was no longer a person. I was a risk, a walking political disease, and no one wanted to be seen standing too close. I reached the Great Library. The old librarian at the main desk, Master Elian, had known me since I was a girl. He used to set aside newly acquired scrolls he thought would interest me. He saw me the moment I walked in. His face, usually so warm, became a blank slate. He didn't say my name. He didn't nod. He simply turned his back to me and began meticulously rearranging a shelf of scrolls that was already perfectly ordered. It was a clear, painful message. I cannot see you. I cannot acknowledge you. I will not be a witness to this. His denial hurt more than the averted glances on the street. I walked through the quiet stacks to the cartography section. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and binding glue. I found the book. It was huge, heavy. I pulled it from the shelf. My ledger was still there, tucked into the hollowed-out space in the back cover. It was so small, so thin, just a collection of my own handwriting. But holding it, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was mine. They hadn't found it. They hadn't erased this. As I was leaving the library, I saw him again. Master Elian. He was still at his desk, his back to the entrance. He didn't turn around as I walked out. I wondered if he was protecting himself or if, in his own silent way, he was protecting me by not creating a scene. I decided to believe the latter. It was a small comfort. On my way back to my residence, my route took me past the Ministry of Justice. Standing on the steps, deep in conversation with two of the Emperor's most severe advisors, was a man I knew, a man I respected, Lord Vorlag. We had worked together on the Northern Road proposal for months. He was decent, honest. He saw me. Our eyes met for only a second across the plaza. In that 1 second, I saw everything: pity, deep, profound fear, and a grim resignation. He knew. The entire inner circle knew. The news of my removal was the most important topic of conversation in the palace. They were just waiting for confirmation that the deed was done, that I was gone. The Emperor didn't need soldiers to drag me from the city. He just needed to issue a single decree and let the fear of his displeasure do the rest. The entire social fabric of the capital was now aligned against me. Every person, every institution was now part of the mechanism of my removal. It was a perfect, silent coup against a single person. Back in my residence, I began to pack a small bag. My aide, Kyle, was still there. He was standing by the door, looking lost. I told him he should go, that his service was complete, that it was dangerous for him to be seen here. He looked up at me then. For the first time all evening, he met my eyes. I saw tears in them. He was just a boy, really, caught in something he didn't understand. He told me he had nowhere to go, that his position, his very presence in the capital, was tied to me. I realized with a cold certainty that my erasure would erase him too. He would be marked by his association with me. No one would hire him. The decree wasn't just my ruin, it was his. I gave him most of the money I had. I told him to leave the capital tonight, not to go north toward his home, but to go south, to disappear, to change his name. He didn't want to take the money, but I insisted. It was the last order I would ever give, the last act of authority I had left. He finally took it, and then he was gone. The silence in the residence after he left was different. It was heavier. It was the silence of true solitude. I looked at the clock. It was almost 10, 4 hours until dawn. I sat down. There was nothing left to do but wait for the moment I had to walk out of my own life. I thought about the Emperor. He hadn't summoned me. He hadn't accused me of anything. He had passed a sentence without a trial, without a charge. His silence was the most powerful statement of all. It said, "You are not important enough for an explanation. You are just an inconvenience to be swept away." I had spent my life in service to the idea of a just and rational state, a government built on precedent and law. And in one evening, the Emperor had dismantled that idea with a single, unexplained decree. He wasn't just removing me, he was demonstrating that the rules I had dedicated my life to did not apply to him. That was the real message. Not for me, but for everyone else. The minutes ticked by. Each one felt like a stone dropping into a deep well. I thought about my work, the projects left unfinished, the lines of inquiry that would now go cold. There was the matter of the Western grain shipments, The official reports showed a surplus, but my private notes suggested that the numbers were being falsified, that a powerful general was diverting grain to feed his own legions, building a private army on the emperor's coin. I had been gathering the proof. I was days away from being able to present it. Now, that proof would die with my career. The general would get away with it. The emperor would be weakened, and he wouldn't even know why. Was that why I was being removed? Did the general get to the emperor first? Did he paint me as a traitor, a spy, to cover his own tracks? It was possible. It was likely. The fear wasn't just for myself anymore. It was for the capital, for the empire. I was a warning system, a nerve ending for the state, and they had just severed the nerve. They were flying blind, and they didn't even know it. The clock struck midnight. I stood up. I put on my cloak. It was time to start walking. It would take me at least 3 hours to reach the southern gate on foot. I had to be outside the walls by dawn. If I was found within the city after the first light, the decree implied the penalty was absolute. The guards at the gate would have their orders. I opened the door to my residence, and I saw a man standing there. He wasn't one of the guards. He wore the livery of the emperor's personal staff, a palace messenger. My heart stopped. This was it. They had changed their minds. They weren't even giving me until dawn. They were here to arrest me now, to take me to the dungeons. The messenger looked just as confused as I felt. He held out a scroll, not the same kind as before. This was smaller, sealed with a different private seal. He seemed nervous. He told me the decree had been amended. He said I was not to leave. He said I was to come with him. Immediately, the emperor would see me now. The walk to the palace was surreal. The 2 guards who had been watching my house were gone. The streets were quiet, empty. The messenger walked ahead of me, silent. He didn't offer any explanation. I didn't ask for one. I was in a state of shock. My mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. Leave. Don't leave. It was a contradiction. A suspended decree was unheard of. It showed hesitation. It showed weakness. An emperor's word was supposed to be stone. What had changed between dusk and midnight? We entered the palace through a side entrance, away from the grand halls and the court. We walked through service corridors I had never seen before. The air in the palace felt tense. I saw a few guards in the corridors, and they looked confused. They would see the messenger's livery, see me, and share uncertain glances. Orders and counter-orders must have been flying through the palace for the last hour. I was being taken to the emperor's private study, a place I had never been, a place few people ever were. The messenger stopped at a heavy door. He knocked once. A voice from inside called for us to enter. The messenger opened the door, motioned for me to go in, and then closed it behind me, leaving me alone with the emperor. He was standing by a large table covered in maps and documents. He did not look at me. He was the most powerful man in the world, and in that moment, he looked like a man trapped in a room with a problem he didn't know how to solve. The room was silent for a long time. I was the one who broke it. I asked him why. Why was I ordered to leave? He finally looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes. There was something else, a weariness, a deep, profound exhaustion. He didn't apologize. He didn't make excuses. He told me the decree was not about me. Not really. He explained that a faction at court, led by the general I had been investigating, had come to him. They had presented a case against me. They said my work was creating instability, that my quiet influence was encouraging dissent among the lower ministers and the guilds. They told him I was a threat, not a rebel, not a traitor, but something more dangerous, a source of inconvenient truth that could be used to question his authority. They had pushed him. They had insisted that for the stability of the empire, I had to be removed, swiftly and silently, before my influence could spread. Issuing the decree, he admitted, was the path of least resistance. It was easier to sign that paper than to confront a powerful general and his allies. It was easier to sacrifice one archivist than to risk a fracture in his own court. So he signed it. He condemned me to protect his own peace. I felt a cold anger rise in me, not for myself, but for the office he held. I asked him what changed. Why was I here and not on a dark road outside the city? He looked down at the table. He told me that after he signed the decree, he had tried to work, but he couldn't. He had requested a document, an old trade treaty. His aides couldn't find it. He had asked for the tax revenue projections for the next 5 years. The report they brought him was incomplete, missing the historical context that gave the numbers meaning. He had realized in the space of a few hours that in removing me, he had removed a part of his own government, a part of his own memory, his own understanding. He had cut out the nerve, and he had immediately felt the numbness. He had made himself weaker, more blind, and he had done it out of fear. At midnight, he had called his private secretary and amended the decree. He had suspended the order for my removal. He had done it without consulting the general or his advisors. He had done it alone. The confusion I had sensed in the palace, it was real. He had contradicted his own public command. He had created the very instability he was trying to avoid. I stood there, looking at the man who held the fate of millions in his hands. He had tried to erase me to appear strong, and in doing so, he had revealed his own weakness to himself, and now to me. The silence returned to the room. We both understood the danger of what had just happened. The decree had been issued. The court knew. The capital's rumor mill would be churning by morning. If he simply cancelled the order, he would look weak, indecisive, a ruler who bowed to pressure and then changed his mind. The general and his faction would be emboldened. They would see it as a victory. They would know they could manipulate him. If he let the decree stand, he would lose me. He would lose the institutional memory I represented. He would be ruling in the dark. He had created a political trap for himself, and I was standing in the middle of it. He then laid out my options. He spoke not as an emperor, but as a man trying to solve a complex equation. Option 1. I could leave the capital at dawn as originally planned, but he would change the order. It would be a public, honorable reassignment. I would be named the governor of a small, distant province. My reputation would be saved. I would be safe, but I would be gone. The general would win. The truth of the grain shipments would be buried forever. Option 2. I could remain in the capital. The decree would be quietly, officially nullified, but I would not return to the archives. I would be given a new title, an honorary position at court. I would be under his direct protection and his direct scrutiny. I would be a bird in a gilded cage. My independence would be gone. I would no longer be a source of objective fact. I would be another one of his courtiers, my voice filtered through his authority. He was offering me a choice between honorable exile and silent submission. Both options solved his problem. They either removed me from the political game or made me a pawn in it. I looked at him, and the emperor's words settled in the space between us, possessing a physical weight. They were not an offer of reprieve. They were the architecture of two different prisons, and he was asking me to choose my cell. The silence that followed was not the weaponized absence I had felt on the streets. It was a vacuum, waiting for my decision to give it political gravity. He had confessed his weakness, but in doing so, he had transformed it into a new kind of chain, binding my fate to his. He was offering me a choice. It was no choice at all. My mind, a practiced instrument of analysis, began to dissect the first option, an honorable exile. The words themselves were a contradiction, a political oxymoron. Honor was a function of one's place within the system, a recognition of value to the state. Exile was the severance of that place. To grant them both was to wrap a dagger in silk. He would give me papers, coin, a comfortable fade into obscurity, and in return, I would cede the field. General Valerius and his shadow council would complete their silent coup. The grain reserves they were already diverting from the northern provinces would become the foundation of a private army. The institutional memory I embodied, the knowledge of treaties, of precedents, of the very financial structures Valerius was exploiting, would be gone, amputated. The state was a body politic, and I had been a nerve ending, a part of its central nervous system. Exile was not a humane release, it was a lobotomy. The emperor would be left with phantom limb pain, reaching for knowledge that was no longer there, while the infection of the general's ambition metastasized in the heart of the empire. I saw the future with the chilling clarity of a historian, a hollowed-out throne, a puppet emperor governed by a man who had successfully erased the one person who could prove his treason. The honor of my exile was the price of the empire's integrity. It was a cost I could not sanction. So I turned my focus to the second prison, the gilded cage, a subordinate position hidden from the court, my counsel a secret flowing only to him. I would be a ghost in the machine, a whisper in the halls of power I once walked with authority. My name, Ceres Althea, would remain erased. I would be given a new one, or none at all. I would be a function, disconnected from the identity I had built. It was a different kind of erasure, not a removal from the archive, but a redaction. A black line drawn through my life, leaving the text around it intact, but forever altered by the absence. He thought he was offering me proximity to power. He was wrong. He was offering me proximity to the mechanism. I would still be connected to the vast, intricate clockwork of the state. My hands would be bound, but my mind could still watch the gears, note the imbalances, and calculate the stresses. I would be a political disease contained in a quarantine ward, but I would still be alive within the body politic. I could still diagnose the contagion. The risk was immense. The emperor had already demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice me for political expediency. A secret known to only one man is not a secret. It is a liability. The moment my existence became more inconvenient than my absence, he would complete the erasure he had only begun. I would be a footnote he could tear from the page. And yet, the ledger I had retrieved from my rooms was not just a record of corruption. It was proof. It was the inconvenient truth that gave me leverage, a truth he now knew I possessed. He did not summon me here out of a sudden crisis of conscience. He summoned me because he had performed a calculus of risk and realized that an archivist with proof cast out into the world was a far greater threat than an archivist with proof caged within his walls. He feared my knowledge beyond his control more than he feared the general's ambition within it. He feared it. That was the key. His fear was the fulcrum upon which this entire political trap rested. He was not a tyrant. Tyrants are defined by the simplicity of their power. He was a manager, trapped by the complexity of a system he could no longer read. He had thrown away the index and now found himself lost in the archive. My function had never been to serve the emperor as a man. My function was to serve the crown as an institution, to be its memory, its conscience, its balancing agent. The man before me was a temporary vessel for that institution, and he was failing. He was weak, reactive, and compromised. But the institution itself, the vast, sprawling, and fragile entity that was the empire, was what mattered. It was the work of my life. To abandon it now would be to concede that the work was meaningless, that memory was discardable, that truth had no inherent power. It would be the ultimate failure of my own convictions. Exile was personal freedom at the cost of public duty. The cage was public duty at the cost of personal freedom. For the archivist, there was only one possible answer. The calculus was cold and absolute. A person can be erased, a principle cannot. I finally lifted my gaze from the polished floor and met his. The anxiety in his eyes was stark. He was an emperor begging a condemned woman to save him from his own decree. "You have misunderstood my purpose, Your Majesty," I said. My voice was level, stripped of emotion, the voice I used to recite precedent in the High Council. My role is not a position to be bartered. It is a function of the state. Its necessity is not dependent on my title, my presence at court, or your favor. He stiffened, a flicker of imperial pride warring with his desperation. "I am the memory of the crown," I continued, each word a carefully placed stone. "You have demonstrated that you cannot rule without it. The general's corruption is not a political inconvenience. It is a structural failure. It threatens the foundation. Exile allows that failure to cascade. Therefore, it is not an option." I let the silence hang for a beat. I was not accepting his offer. I was stating the logical conclusion. "I will remain," I said. It was not a plea, it was a pronouncement. Not as a subordinate, not as a petitioner in a gilded cage. I will remain as the Imperial archivist, whether the title is spoken or not. My access must be absolute, my intelligence delivered without filter. I will be a ghost, as you say. But ghosts, you will find, are not known for their deference. They are known for haunting the living until the truth is brought to light. A long moment passed. The Emperor stared at me, and I saw the final shift in his understanding. He had hoped to acquire a tool. He had instead shackled himself to a conscience. He was trapped, not with a servant, but with the very principle of institutional memory he had tried to discard. The decree of exile remained, a public fact. But here, in the silent heart of the palace, a new reality had been forged. He finally gave a slow, weary nod. The resignation in the gesture was profound. It was the surrender of a man who had been outmaneuvered by the very system he was supposed to command. "The east wing of the palace library has been sealed for a generation," he said, his voice raspy. "The archivist's private residence. It has its own entrance to the lower stacks. No one has been inside since my grandfather's time. It will be your residence." He did not say home. He did not say prison. It was a space outside the political geography of the court, an annex of memory. "Lord Jin," he called, his voice regaining a sliver of its authority. The chamberlain, who had been a statue of perfect discretion by the door, stepped forward. "Escort her to the old residence. See that she is provided for. No one is to know she is there. No one." Lord Jian's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, no pity, no curiosity. There was only the blank, professional veneer of a man obeying a complicated and dangerous order. I had ceased to be Ceres Althea. I had become a state secret. As I followed the chamberlain from the room, leaving the emperor alone with the consequences of his contradictory decrees, I clutched the ledger hidden in my cloak. I was a ghost now, haunting the scenes of my own life. But my erasure was incomplete. There had been a record of my existence. There would be again. The emperor did not look at me as he left. His departure was the inverse of his summons. A quiet, hurried affair, the retreat of a man unburdened of a problem he could not solve, only contain. He spoke a single word to the guards outside, and the heavy oak door swung shut, its closing not a sound, but a pressure change in the air. The final, resonant thud of a heavy bolt sliding into place was the period at the end of a sentence. My life as Ceres Althea was concluded. I stood in the center of the room, a ghost haunting the scenes of my own internment. The silence that fell was absolute. It was not the weaponized silence of the city, nor the charged silence of the emperor's study. This was a structural silence, the sound of forgotten things. It was the silence of a sealed tomb, and I, the living occupant, was its primary artifact. Moonlight, thick with the dust of decades, slanted through the tall, grime-streaked windows, illuminating the spectral shapes of furniture shrouded in white canvas. A funeral procession for an era I had never known. My first act in this new existence was a slow, deliberate survey. I was the archivist of my own prison. The space was a suite of rooms, once a private apartment for a favored royal consort, left to decay when her name was struck from the Imperial line. The irony was not lost on me. Another erasure, another ghost to share the space. I ran a hand over a shrouded harpsichord. The canvas was stiff, the dust beneath it a fine, sedimentary layer. Here was a drawing room, a sleeping chamber, a small study with a writing desk that faced a cold marble hearth. Everything was preserved and dead, a perfect metaphor for my new function. I was no longer a person. I was an apparatus of state, hidden within the palace walls like a secret mechanism in a clock. The emperor had not saved me. He had reclassified me. I had been a public record, and now I was a state secret. The change was merely one of access. Before, I was a resource for the entire government. Now, my audience was one. He had not chosen truth over politics. He had simply created a private, parallel system for it, a clandestine branch of his own conscience he could consult at his leisure. This was not a victory. It was stasis, a political deferment. In the corner of the study, I found the core of our bargain. Behind a threadbare tapestry depicting a long-forgotten naval victory was a small, square door. A dumbwaiter, its ropes dry and coiled like sleeping serpents. This was my link to the outside world, my access. It was a nerve ending stripped from the body politic, rerouted to this forgotten chamber to serve a singular, secret purpose. Through it, the archives would flow to me. Through it, my analysis would flow back to the emperor. I was a mind in a box. The thought was a chilling one, a sudden draft in the still air of my resolve. My freedom was an intellectual construct. My body was confined to these 3 rooms, dependent on the silent, faceless delivery of food, water, and lamplight. My existence was contingent upon the emperor's word, a promise made under duress by a man whose defining characteristic was his fear of inconvenient truths. He feared Valerius. He feared the court. He feared me. And now he had caged the thing he feared most, hoping to control it. I was wrong. He didn't hope to control it. He hoped to use it. That realization was the key. It unlocked me from the paralysis of the moment. My resilience was not in my body, but in my function. As long as I was useful, I was safe. As long as I was the only one who could decipher the intricate lies of his administration, I held the power. He had given me a cage, yes, but he had also given me a laboratory. I crossed to the simple cot in the sleeping chamber, the only piece of furniture not under shroud, and retrieved the one object I had carried from my former life. The ledger. It felt heavy in my hands, not with the weight of its paper and leather, but with the density of the secrets it contained. It was the Rosetta Stone for a silent coup. Sitting at the dusty writing desk, I opened it. The familiar columns of figures and scrawled annotations were a comfort. The language of pure data a balm to my fractured identity. This was my work. This was me. The Emperor had erased Ceres Althea, but he could not erase the archivist. That function was absolute. General Valerius believed his corruption was a masterpiece of subtlety. 1,000 tiny cuts to the Imperial treasury, each too small to notice. He saw the state's ledgers as individual threads, easily frayed. He failed to understand that the archives were not a collection of threads, but a single interwoven tapestry. My ledger was the key to its pattern. I began to work, my mind slipping back into its natural state. The grain diversions were the symptom, not the disease. I ignored them. Instead, I focused on the names. The quartermasters in provincial garrisons who falsified spoilage reports. The shipping magnates who rerouted barges for emergency repairs that never occurred. The junior ministers in the treasury who approved budget reallocations with unprecedented speed. Valerius had not built an army with stolen grain. He had built it with a network of compromised men. Each name in my ledger was a node of infection. For hours, I sat in the silent moonlit room, my only companion, the whisper of paper and the scratching of my own notes, made with a sliver of charcoal I'd found in the hearth. I was cross-referencing the ledger with the vast eidetic library of my own memory. A name here, Provincial Magistrate Orion, connected to a land purchase dispute I had arbitrated 3 years prior. A discrepancy there, the Argent Trading Company linked to a shipping contract whose terms had been renegotiated by the Emperor's father. Each connection was a new line of inquiry, a new vulnerability in the general's scheme. He was building a shadow state, a mirror of the Empire's own bureaucracy, loyal only to him. The grain was not just for feeding soldiers, it was a currency. It was a tool of patronage, a way to buy the loyalty of men the Emperor's silver could not reach. This was not simply treason. It was the construction of an alternative. By the time the first pale gray light of dawn touched the windows, I knew what I needed. My memory, while formidable, was not infallible. I needed the source documents. I needed to test the chain of my new authority. I took a clean sheet of foolscap from a small supply left on the desk, a thoughtful or perhaps calculated provision. My request was precise. Not the Grand Treasury ledgers, not the grain silo inventories. That would be too obvious, a direct challenge. Instead, I requested something mundane, something bureaucratic, something that would appear meaningless to any observer, but was, to me, the key to the entire structure. To the office of the Imperial archivist, I wrote, the title, A Phantom Limb. Requisition, all canal toll and way station receipts from the outer prefectures third quarter, last fiscal year. Cross-reference with barge manifests from the Argent Trading Company for the same period. Urgent review required for agricultural output reconciliation. It was a perfect piece of bureaucratic misdirection. Plausible, dry, and utterly damning if the data showed what I suspected it would. Barges recorded as carrying textiles, paying tolls for the weight of grain. A simple, elegant lie repeated 100 times over. I folded the note. There was no name, no signature, a request from a ghost. I walked to the dumbwaiter, my heart a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I pulled the stiff rope, and the small wooden box ascended from the depths of the palace with a dry groan. I placed the note inside. For a moment, my fingers rested on the wood. This was it, the first cast of a line into a deep and dangerous ocean. I was testing the Emperor. I was testing the reality of my own existence. I let go of the rope. The dumbwaiter descended, its rasping sound fading into the profound quiet of the palace's forgotten corners. Then there was only silence. I stood before the empty shaft, a cipher in a sealed room, waiting for the system to tell me if I still existed. The sun was rising, but for me, the dawn had not yet broken. It was suspended, held hostage by a promise made in the dark. The silence that followed was a different substance from the one that had haunted the city streets. That had been a public silence, a shared, weaponized absence of sound. This was a private vacuum, the perfect stillness of a tomb. The dumbwaiter's rope had gone slack, its soft thudding against the shaft wall fading into nothing. My request was gone, delivered into the machinery of the palace, a single thought injected into the body politic from which I had been excised. Now there was only the weight. It was a clock of a different sort, not the inexorable march toward the dawn gate, but the slow, agonizing drip of moments measuring the Emperor's fear against his desperation. Each second that passed was a grain of sand tipping the scales. I did not pace. I did not peer from the tall, grime-filmed window that offered a sliver of a manicured courtyard I was forbidden to enter. To do so would be to concede my own anxiety, to give it form and motion. Instead, I stood before the closed wooden door of the dumbwaiter shaft, a sentinel at the gates of my own gilded cage. My new world was an equation of controlled variables. 4 rooms, a sitting room furnished with dust-sheeted relics of a forgotten courtier, a bedchamber with a mattress that smelled of cedar and thyme, a small washroom with plumbing that gurgled like a sleeping beast, and this, the small antechamber that housed my only connection to the outside world. They were not rooms, but containers. My existence had been reduced to a state secret, a political singularity confined to this sealed-off wing of the palace. I was no longer a person. I was a function, isolated and refined. I was a ghost haunting a house that was not my own. The sounds of the living palace were faint, spectral things. The distant echo of a guard's boot on marble, the muffled laughter of a servant, the mournful groan of the palace's ancient architecture settling. They were reminders of a world that was now hermetically sealed from me, a world that believed me to be a disgraced exile, a footnote already fading from institutional memory. The erasure was complete, and yet I remained, a paradox, a secret that could undo the Emperor himself. He feared me, but he feared being without me more. That was the fulcrum on which my survival rested. I was the inconvenient truth he could neither afford to acknowledge nor discard. This sealed wing, this secret pact, was his solution. To keep the truth caged, to consult it only in the dark. Time stretched, thinning until it was transparent. An hour passed, then 2. The weak afternoon light began to yellow, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Doubt, a cold and creeping contagion, began to seep into the sterile environment of my logic. Perhaps he had reconsidered. Perhaps the terror of what Valerius would do if he discovered this duplicity had finally outweighed the terror of ruling blind. Perhaps the dumbwaiter would remain empty, a monument to his ultimate cowardice. My hand, resting on the cool wood of the shaft door, was steady. My pulse was a slow, deliberate rhythm. If he betrayed me now, it would be a confirmation, not a surprise. A fact to be archived. Then a sound. It was not loud. It was a faint, dry scraping from within the walls. The whisper of a rope tightening, the groan of a pulley unused for decades. My entire being focused on that sound. It was the only event in my universe. The scraping grew into a rhythmic, labored pulling, the sound of a promise being kept, or a trap being set. The dumbwaiter was ascending. I did not move until the motion stopped, punctuated by a solid thump as the cabinet settled into place behind the door. The silence rushed back in, now heavy with potential. I reached for the latch, my fingers methodical. The door swung inward. It was not empty. Stacked neatly inside was a modest pile of gray string-bound folios. The official seal of the Imperial quartermaster was stamped on the cover of the topmost file. Grain and transport. Logistics, 3rd fiscal quarter. The first of my requests. Beneath it lay the other 2. Northern garrison supply manifests and provincial infrastructure budgets. I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of relief. There was only a cold, sharp clarity. The pact held. The Emperor had chosen his dependency over his fear. The game had begun. I lifted the folios out one by one, their weight a familiar, grounding presence in my hands. The dry, dusty scent of official paper and aging ink was the smell of my former life, now delivered to me like rations to a prisoner. I carried them to the large, dust-covered table in the center of the sitting room, pulling back the sheet to reveal a surface of dark, polished wood. This would be my new archive, my war room. I untied the first folio, the one concerning grain logistics. My work had never been about simple record-keeping. It was about seeing the patterns within the data, the narrative hidden in the numbers. I knew the Empire's metabolism, the flow of its resources, the rhythm of its commerce, the subtle tells of its health and its sickness. To my eyes, these ledgers were not dry accounts. They were a living anatomy of the state. And Valerius had treated the state as his personal patient, bleeding it slowly, methodically. It was all there, just as my private notes had suggested. The official numbers were balanced, the books immaculate. It was a work of art, a perfect forgery of a healthy system. But I was not looking at the numbers themselves. I was looking at the spaces between them. I cross-referenced the grain shipments to the northern garrison with the transport manifests. A discrepancy. A small one, easily dismissed as a clerical error or spoilage. 1,000 bushels designated for the 3rd Legion's winter stores in the north were routed through a secondary depot in the western foothills, Valerius's home province. Alone, it was nothing. A single, anomalous data point. But then I opened the second folio. The northern garrison's own supply manifests showed they had received their full allotment. They had signed for grain that had never arrived. The signatures were authentic. The soldiers were loyal to their general. They would sign whatever he commanded. He wasn't just stealing resources, he was buying complicity. He was building his shadow state with the emperor's own coin and authority. This was the genius of his treason. It was not a violent seizure of power, but a parasitic integration. He was growing his own army, his own loyalists, his own supply chain, all within the legitimate apparatus of the empire. He was hollowing it out from the inside, leaving the emperor a hollow shell of authority, a walking effigy. I worked for hours. The light outside faded from gold to bruised purple, and finally to the deep, starless black of a capital night. I did not light a lamp. My eyes, long accustomed to the dim light of the archives, could read the faint script in the gloom. The darkness was a comfort, a cloak. It was the element in which I now operated. By the time I leaned back, the truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a schematic. The diverted grain-fed soldiers whose names appeared on no official roster. The infrastructure budgets showed funds for roads and bridges in desolate, strategically useless territories. Useless to the empire, but vital for connecting Valerius's network of loyalist towns and hidden armories. He was not just preparing for a coup. He had been enacting one for years. A silent coup waged on paper and in the shadows. My erasure had not been a preventative measure. It had been a final cleansing, the last step before his power became absolute. He had needed to remove the one person in the empire capable of reading the story he had written in the margins of its ledgers. There had been mine. I sat in the darkness, the folios spread before me like a dissected corpse. The emperor had no idea. He saw Valerius as a political threat, a powerful courtier to be managed. He did not see him as a rival sovereign. He thought he was balancing power. He was, in fact, ceding it. My path was clear. I was not merely to be the emperor's memory. I was to be his sight, his comprehension. I would perform the vivisection of Valerius's shadow state, document by document, and lay the pieces before a man too terrified to see it for himself. I stacked the folios, retied them with their string, and placed them back in the dumbwaiter. With them, I placed a new, single sheet of parchment. On it, I had written my next request. It was no longer a broad inquiry. It was a scalpel aimed at a specific nerve. Personnel transfer records for the Western Provincial Guard, last 2 years. All promotions authorized by General Valerius. I closed the door and gave the rope a single, sharp pull, the signal for retrieval. Then I waited in the absolute dark, listening for the answering groan of the pulley. I was no longer a ghost haunting a palace. I was the ghost in the machine, and I was just beginning my work. The pact was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared, exhausted silence. We were no longer emperor and subject, but two conspirators bound by mutual desperation. My erasure was now a functional lie, a piece of political theater we would both perform. He was the gilded figurehead, and I, the ghost in his machine. He led me from the audience chamber himself, a move of such profound irregularity that it felt like another confession. The guards in the corridor, rigid as statues, tracked our movement with their eyes, their faces blank masks of discipline. They saw their emperor escorting the condemned. They saw a living contradiction, and their training offered no protocol for it. Their silence was a question hanging in the torchlight. We did not speak. The walk to the palace's forgotten west wing was a funeral procession for one. This wing had been sealed for a generation, since the azure pox had claimed the emperor's aunt and her entire household. It was a place of bad memory, a scar on the palace's architectural skin, which made it the perfect sanctuary, the perfect tomb. We stopped before a heavy oak door, its iron fittings filmed with the rust of disuse. A single Imperial steward stood waiting, his face pale and his posture unnaturally stiff. He held a ring of keys, their weight seeming to pull his arm toward the floor. He did not look at me. He did not, I suspected, dare to look at the emperor. He was a man tasked with an order that made no sense, and his fear was a palpable thing, a scent of cold sweat in the air. "The wing has been swept," the steward murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "Provisions are laid in. The arrangements are as you commanded, Your Majesty." The emperor gave a curt nod. He took the largest key, a piece of black iron that looked medieval, and fitted it into the lock. The grinding protest of the mechanism was the only sound. It was the noise of a system being forced to accommodate an impossible new reality. He pushed the door open. The air that drifted out was a physical presence, stale, cold, and thick with the dust of 30 years. It smelled of forgotten things. It smelled of my new life. "The door will be locked from the outside," the emperor said, his voice low, meant only for me. He still refused to meet my gaze, focusing instead on the dark void beyond the threshold. "The steward will be the only one with a key. He's loyal to me, not to the office. His name is Kalen." I processed the information. A single point of failure. A man whose loyalty was personal, not institutional. It was a risk. Everything was a risk. I stepped across the threshold. There was no ceremony to it. One moment I was in the living palace, a nerve ending of the state. The next, I was in its dead tissue. The emperor lingered for a second, a silhouette against the torchlight of the hall. "The first request," he said, his voice strained. "What is it?" I did not have to think. The grain shipment manifests for the northern prefectures for the last 5 years. All of them? And the corresponding military payrolls for the garrisons stationed there? He nodded, a jerky, uncertain motion. "It will be done." Then he pulled the door shut. The lock turned, a final grinding sound. The heavy bar on the outside slid into its brackets with a solid, definitive thud. Access denied. I was now a rumor. A ghost story whispered in the halls I once commanded. I was erased. My new world consisted of 4 rooms, a dusty bedchamber with a mattress that smelled of cedar and thyme, a small study, a washroom with a cold water pump, and a sitting room dominated by a cavernous, soot-blackened fireplace. The furniture was draped in white shrouds, making the space feel like a morgue for abandoned decor. I pulled one off a chair, the canvas stiff with age. Dust motes danced in the single beam of moonlight slanting through a tall, grimy window that overlooked a walled, overgrown garden. It was the only window, my only view of the outside world. I felt a tremor of something that was not quite panic. It was a cold, clear-eyed assessment of loss, the loss of movement, the loss of light, the loss of faces. I had traded the capital for this cage, but a cage was also a fortress. Here, Valerius could not reach me. Here, the whispers and the averted eyes of the court could not wound me. Here, I had only one function left: to think. In the corner of the study, I found the core of my new existence. It was a dumbwaiter, a simple box of wood and rope set into the wall. Its shaft, the Emperor had explained, descended not into the kitchens, but into a disused sub-level of the Imperial archives, a section only he and now the steward Kalen could access. It was my pulley to the world's heart, my clandestine connection to the body politic I was meant to haunt. I spent the first night not sleeping, but preparing. I cleared the large table in the study, wiping away the thick layer of dust with the hem of my tunic. I laid out the tools I had, the small, coded ledger I had risked everything to retrieve, a few quills, and a pot of ink from the provisions. The ledger felt warm in my hands, a concentration of truth in a city built on convenient fictions. It was the seed. Everything would grow from it. Dawn arrived not as a sunrise, but as a subtle graying of the light in my single window. It was the dawn I was supposed to have fled. Instead, I was at the very heart of the empire, more central to its survival than ever before, and utterly invisible. A paradox. The emperor was a master of them. The first test came mid-morning, a soft scraping sound from the wall. The dumbwaiter. I hauled on the rope, my muscles protesting. The box ascended, heavy and laden. Inside were not scrolls, but a tray, bread, cheese, a pitcher of water, and a single, perfect apple. A prisoner's meal. Beneath it, however, was a folded note on Imperial parchment. They are being collected. The volume is significant. It will take time. Be patient. The handwriting was the Emperor's, hasty, anxious. I held the note for a long moment. It was a confirmation. The pact was real. He had not changed the decree at midnight. He had merely altered its terms. My exile was now vertical instead of horizontal. I ate the bread, my mind already working. General Valerius was not a simple thief. A man like him did not engage in common graft. His was a more sophisticated form of corruption, a kind of bureaucratic predation that used the state's own systems against itself. He would not leave a trail of stolen gold. He would leave a trail of discrepancies, of numbers that almost balanced, of resources allocated for one purpose and quietly used for another. He was building his shadow state not with swords and banners, but with requisitions and shipping manifests. He was waging a silent coup, and the ink was his weapon. To catch him, I had to map the pathology of the entire system. Late that afternoon, the dumbwaiter groaned again. This time, it was full. Stacks of scrolls, bound in twine, filled the small container. The grain manifests. I hauled them out, my heart quickening with a familiar thrill. The hunt. I was an archivist again. This was my language, my territory. I spent the rest of the day and deep into the night unrolling the scrolls across the floor of the study. The room became a sea of parchment. 5 years of grain shipments to the north. Thousands of entries detailing tonnage, origin, destination, spoilage reports. It was the empire's metabolism, rendered in ink, mundane, repetitive, and somewhere within it, the cancer. I began the work, cross-referencing the manifests with the entries in my own small ledger. My ledger was the key, the Rosetta Stone for this mountain of official lies. It contained the names of shell corporations, intermediaries, and transport guilds secretly owned by Valerius's cronies. I wasn't looking for a missing shipment. I was looking for a pattern, a ghost signature in the logistics. Hours bled together, marked only by the slow crawl of the light across the dusty floorboards. The silence of the wing was absolute, broken only by the rustle of parchment and the scratching of my quill. It was a purer silence than the one I had experienced on the streets. That had been a weaponized silence, full of meaning and threat. This was a nullity, the silence of the void. In it, I could finally hear the data speak. It was on the third day that I found it. A discrepancy. not in the grand totals which had been meticulously falsified to match projections. The forgery was too perfect. Valerius was too smart for that. The error was in the details. A series of shipments to Garrison 4 in the foothills of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. According to the manifests, they had received a 20% surplus of grain for 3 consecutive years, justified by a note citing preparations for winter isolation. Normal enough, but the payrolls for that same garrison, which had arrived in a separate delivery, showed its numbers had been reduced by half during that same period. Fewer men, more food. A massive, inexplicable surplus. It was not a smoking gun. It was subtler. It was a thread, a single, loose thread in the vast, complex tapestry of the state. But if I pulled it, I knew, with the cold certainty of a mathematician staring at a flawed equation, that Valerius's entire edifice of deceit would begin to unravel. I stood up, my back aching, and walked to the wall. Next to the dumbwaiter was a small brass-covered hole, a speaking tube, another of the Emperor's clandestine arrangements. I unstopped it and blew softly. A moment later, a faint hiss answered from the other end. I did not need to announce myself. Who else could it be? "I have something," I said, my voice quiet in the immense silence of the room. "It begins in the north." The payrolls were the key. Grain could be explained away as spoilage, a clerical error, a phantom of logistics. But names were not phantoms. Men required payment, shelter, and purpose, and General Valerius was providing all three. The manifests were the body of his treason. The payrolls were its beating heart. I had found the first thread, and as I sat at the heavy oak desk in my gilded prison, I felt the familiar, cold thrill of the hunt. It was the only warmth left to me. My new existence was a study in silence and routine. My world had shrunk to the dimensions of this forgotten suite of rooms. A study choked with the Emperor's discarded histories, a small bedchamber, and a washroom with plumbing that gurgled like a dying man. The windows were leaded glass, thick and distorting, turning the capital into a watercolor abstraction. I was a ghost, haunting a machine of my own design. My only connection to the living world, to the apparatus of the state I once commanded, was the dumb waiter. It was an archaic thing, a relic of a time before servants' corridors, operated by a simple rope and pulley. Twice a day, it would ascend. In the morning, it brought a sparse breakfast and a leather folio containing the documents the Emperor had requisitioned for me. In the evening, it brought a simple dinner, and I would place my own folio inside for its descent. My analyses, my questions, my quiet directives. It was a bizarre and fragile symbiosis, a political dialogue conducted through the exchange of paper and bread. My first report was a model of precision. I did not accuse, I presented the arithmetic of treason. I cross-referenced the grain shipments marked as lost from the western prefectures with the sudden, inexplicable surge in recruitment numbers for the 3rd and 7th legions, Valerius's legions stationed near those same prefectures. I attached the falsified payrolls, noting the ghost soldiers who existed on paper to launder the funds needed to pay for the real, unlisted ones. The ledger I had retrieved was the codex for this entire shadow economy. Without it, these connections would have remained disparate, meaningless data points. With it, they formed a schematic of betrayal. I worked for 2 days, the scratching of my quill the only sound to break the oppressive quiet. I distilled the complex web of corruption into 3 pages of lucid, undeniable logic. It was not a plea for justice, It was an autopsy report on the integrity of the Imperial army. I placed the folio in the dumbwaiter, my hand hesitating for a moment on the cool leather. This was the first test of our pact, the first measure of the Emperor's resolve. I pulled the rope, and the box descended into darkness. The next morning, it returned with my breakfast. Beneath the plate was a single sheet of the Emperor's heavy vellum, folded once. There was no salutation, no preamble, just 2 words in his cramped, severe script. It was not courage. It was not resolve. It was the desperate command of a man who had realized he could not afford to be blind, even if he was too afraid to see. It was enough. My investigation deepened. The grain and the payrolls were the circulation. I now needed to find the skeleton. An army, even a secret one, requires more than men and food. It requires steel, training grounds, fortifications. It requires a physical footprint on the world. My next request to the Emperor was more ambitious. I asked for the complete acquisition logs from the Ministry of Works for the past 2 years, specifically any land purchases or material requisitions related to border defense projects. I also requested the full logistical charters from the Quartermaster General detailing the transport of lumber, quarried stone, and iron ore. This was a far more dangerous inquiry. These were not records of ephemeral goods like grain. Land deeds were permanent. Building contracts were concrete. Pulling these files was not like tracing a missing shipment. It was like questioning the very foundation of the Empire's infrastructure. The Emperor must have understood the risk. A request of this magnitude, originating from the palace without a clear departmental sponsor, would raise alarms. It was a nerve ending being tweaked, and the pain would travel directly to the man who had his hand on every lever of the military machine, General Valerius. For 3 days, the dumbwaiter brought only food. The folio space was empty. The silence from my room remained unbroken, but the silence from the palace was different. It was a charged, withholding silence. I was a prisoner waiting for a verdict. In my isolation, I began to map Valerius's ambition not as a simple plot, but as a competing form of governance. He was not merely a corrupt general, he was an architect. He was using the Empire's resources, its own bureaucratic bloodstream, to nourish a parasitic state, a mirror image of the true one, loyal only to him. He was not planning a coup. He was building a state within a state. On the 4th morning, the dumbwaiter ascended with a groan of protest. It was heavier than usual. Inside were 3 enormous dust-choked ledgers bound in iron. Ministry of Works, Land Acquisitions, Western Prefectures. He had done it. The weak, frightened man had risked the ire of his most powerful general to feed the ghost in his walls. I spent the next week in a fever of analysis. I did not sleep. I barely ate. The ledgers became my world. I cross-referenced the land deeds with old survey maps I had memorized years ago. The official purpose cited for each acquisition was the construction of new watchtowers and defensive ramparts against imagined barbarian threats. Plausible, defensible, but the geography told a different story. The plots of land were not positioned for defense. They did not secure mountain passes or river crossings. They formed a strategic network, an internal spine of control that connected Valerius's legions, secured major trade routes, and isolated the capital. He was not building a wall to keep enemies out. He was building a cage to keep the Emperor in. The manifests from the Quartermaster General confirmed it. Tons of iron and stone, officially destined for border forts that were never constructed, had been diverted to these new sites. He was using the Empire's institutional memory, the very processes and protocols I had once curated, as a weapon against it. He had turned my archive into his armory. My report this time was thicker, heavier. It was a map of his shadow empire, complete with logistical routes, construction sites, and a precise calculation of the resources he had stolen. It was the anatomy of his silent coup, laid bare on paper. It was undeniable proof, the kind of truth the archives were built to protect, the kind of truth that gets people killed. I sent it down the dumbwaiter and waited for the Emperor's reply. For the first time since my erasure, I felt a sliver of something that resembled hope. It was a foreign, unnerving sensation. The hope was a contagion. I should have known better. The response did not come the next day, nor the day after. The dumbwaiter continued its scheduled ascents and descents, but it carried only food. The folio space remained starkly, accusingly empty. The silence in my suite returned to its natural state, the quiet of a tomb. But the silence from the palace was now the silence of a held breath, the pause before the breaking of a storm. I tried to work, to refine my notes, but my mind was a closed loop. I had presented the Emperor with the complete, unassailable truth of his general's treason. There were only two possible outcomes. The Emperor would act, or the Emperor would break. On the fifth day, the evening dumbwaiter arrived. There was no dinner plate, no water pitcher, just a single blank sheet of parchment lying in the center of the dusty wooden box. It was not the Emperor's vellum. It was cheap, common stock. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process the implication. It was an answer defined by an absence, an erasure. I waited, my hand on the pull rope, for a long time. The abstract watercolor of the city outside my window bled from dusk into night. Finally, with a sense of grim finality, I sent the empty vessel back down. An hour later, I heard the telltale creak of the ropes. It was an unscheduled arrival. My heart, a dull and functional organ, began a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. The box rose into view. Inside was a note. It was the Emperor's vellum this time, and his script was so tight it was nearly illegible. The ink bled by a trembling hand. It was not a command. It was not a query. It was a death sentence. The general has raised concerns about information security. For the protection of the state, the archives are now under his direct oversight. All requests must be routed through his office. Asterisk. Beneath it, a final, chilling addendum. The rope slipped from my numb fingers. I looked from the note to the ledgers stacked on my desk, the map of a treason I could no longer prove. The walls of my prison, once a shield and a sanctuary, had just become absolute. The Emperor had not acted. He had broken. Valerius knew someone was watching. He had not found the ghost, but he had sealed the tomb. The note was not paper. It was vellum, thick and expensive, the kind reserved for permanent record. The irony was a scalpel's twist. It announced the end of all records, the final closing of the account. My account. General Valerius has been granted full oversight of the Imperial archives. Your access is terminated. Effective immediately. Asterisk. There was no signature. There did not need to be. The message was the signature. An act of Valerius, delivered by the hand of the Emperor. The dumbwaiter rope hung limp and motionless. For weeks it had been my lifeline, the artery connecting my mind to the body politic. I had been a ghost in the machine, a secret intelligence. Now the artery was severed. The machine had a new ghost, one who would haunt it with lies instead of truths. I was wrong. I had believed the Emperor, in his weakness, still clung to the utility of truth. I had mistaken his fear of incompetence for a commitment to principle. But Valerius offered a more seductive alternative: the illusion of control without the burden of inconvenient facts. The Emperor had not been forced into this decision. He had chosen it. He had chosen the path of least resistance, a path that led directly to his own gilded cage, one that mirrored my own. A silent coup was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was a calcified fact. The capital, the empire, already belonged to Valerius. He had simply not yet bothered to announce it. He had won. The two words settled not with the fire of outrage, but with the cold, immense weight of a glacier. He had not just won a political battle, he had seized the state's very capacity for self-awareness. He now controlled institutional memory. He could erase his treason not by destroying records, but by rewriting them, recontextualizing them, burying them in a mountain of fabricated legitimacy until the truth was nothing more than a conspiratorial whisper. The ledger in my possession was no longer evidence, it was heresy. The silence in the aftermath was different. Before, it had been the tense, watchful silence of a secret. It was a silence I commanded, a function of my hidden role. Now, it was the suffocating silence of a vacuum. It was oblivion. The dumbwaiter, my sole companion, became a monument to my obsolescence. Its dark, square mouth was no longer pregnant with possibility, but sealed with the finality of a tomb. My prison, once a symbol of a desperate pact, transformed. The plush velvet of the chairs felt like the lining of a coffin. The intricate tapestries depicting ancient imperial victories were no longer history. They were mockeries, shrouds for a dying dynasty. The sealed doors, once a guarantee of my security, were now simply the architecture of my entombment. I was a vestige, a fossil of a function that no longer existed. The archivist, erased. Ceres Althea, interred. Time began to fray. Without the rhythm of documents arriving and reports departing, the days lost their structure. I tracked their passage by the slow march of a sunbeam across the far wall, a sliver of light admitted by one high, grime-streaked window. I watched it crawl from the edge of a bookcase in the morning to the carved leg of a writing desk in the evening. It was my only clock, measuring out the slow, steady decay of my purpose. For a week, I did nothing. I sat in the velvet chair and watched the light. I ate the bland, preserved food that had been stocked in the pantry, my throat tight with the effort of swallowing. Despair was a physical presence in the room, a cold spot that seemed to follow me. It whispered that my life's work had been for nothing, that truth was not a cornerstone of civilization, but a fragile commodity easily discarded. The whisper was seductive. It offered the simple peace of surrender. But the habits of a lifetime are not so easily broken. I was an archivist. My function was to order, to categorize, to understand. To surrender to the chaos of despair was to deny the very essence of my identity. On the 8th day, I stood up. The sunbeam was halfway across the Bokharan rug. If I was to be a prisoner, I would not be a passive one. If my access to the Imperial archives was terminated, then I would begin a new archive, the archive of a forgotten wing. My only artifact was the ledger. I retrieved it from its hiding place, its leather cover cool and solid in my hands. It was the first entry, the founding document of this new solitary work. It was proof, Not for the emperor, not for the courts, but for the simple, immutable fact of its own existence. Truth did not require an audience to be true. I began my work. My methodology was the same as it had ever been. I started with the known boundaries. The wing was comprised of 4 rooms. This main sitting chamber, a small bedroom, a washroom with its own cistern, and a pantry. All were connected. All doors leading out were sealed, the heavy oak bolted and, I presumed, barred from the other side. The windows were too high, too narrow. Escape was a fantasy. My objective was not escape. It was knowledge. I became an archaeologist of my own cell. I ran my fingers over every inch of the walls, feeling for variations in temperature, in texture. I tapped the plaster, listening for the shift in resonance from solid stone to hollow space. I mapped the patterns of dust, the geography of neglect. I studied the construction of the furniture, the joinery of the floorboards, the masonry of the grand, cold fireplace. The work was a balm. It gave me back my function. My mind, which had threatened to turn inward and cannibalize itself, now had a problem to solve. The political trap had been sprung. Valerius and the emperor were phantoms beyond my reach. But this physical trap, this elegant prison, was a text I could learn to read. Days bled into weeks. I catalogued the warp of the wood, the fading of the tapestries, the subtle sag of the floor near the western wall. I created a lexicon of creaks and groans. I learned the room's language. Most of it was mundane, the simple story of disuse and time. But there was one anomaly. It was behind the largest of the tapestries, a sprawling depiction of the first emperor laying the foundation stone of the capital. The woven scene was heavy with age and dust, and no light had touched the wall behind it for a century. I had avoided moving it, wary of the effort and the cloud of filth it would release. But my systematic survey demanded it. Bracing myself, I pulled the heavy fabric aside. The wall behind it was, as expected, solid granite block, mortared with the precision of the old kingdom. I began my routine, tapping my knuckle against the stone, listening. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was uniform, dead, final. I moved down the wall, my ear close. Thud, thud. Then a change. It was almost imperceptible, a slight softening of the sound. I tapped again, harder. It was not a hollow echo, not the promise of a hidden chamber. It was something else, a lack of resonance, as if the stone's vibration was being absorbed. I pressed my palm flat against the cold surface. Nothing. I was about to dismiss it, to mark it as an inconsistency in the granite's density, when I felt it. A draft. It was impossibly faint, a mere whisper of moving air, colder than the stagnant chill of the room. It was not a steady flow, but a rhythmic puff, like a slow, sleeping breath. It seeped through a hairline fracture in the mortar between 2 colossal blocks of stone. There should not have been a draft. The wing was sealed. The air within was my own, recycled and stale. This air was different. It smelled of deep earth, of damp, and of something else, of distance. My heart, which I thought had become a numb, useless organ, began to beat with a purpose I had not felt since the dumbwaiter last ascended. I pressed my ear to the crack. The sound of the draft was a low, mournful sigh, but beneath it, carried on that impossible current of air, was another sound, faint, rhythmic, metallic, the sound of a chain dragging slowly across a stone floor. I was not alone in the forgotten places of the palace. The architecture of my prison had another secret, and my erasure, I realized, was not yet complete. The sound was an error in the system. My prison, until that moment, had been defined by its perfect, hermetic silence. A silence curated to amplify my isolation. The whisper of my own breathing, the rustle of silk against my skin, the soft thud of a book placed on a table. These were the only permissible noises in my gilded cage. This new sound was an intrusion, a variable unaccounted for. It was a dry, rhythmic scrape, the sound of weight being dragged across stone. It was faint, so faint that at first I dismissed it as a phantom of my own strained nerves, a ghost note played by a mind starved of stimulus. But it came again. Scrape, pause, scrape, a cadence of exhaustion. A metronome marking a different kind of time than the one measured by the palace clocks. My breath caught. My function, the core of my being, was to receive, process, and collate information. My mind, deprived of the vast data stream of the empire, seized upon this single, degraded signal with a desperate hunger. I rose from the chaise lounge, the book of provincial poetry falling forgotten to the floor. I pressed my ear against the cold, damask-covered wall from which the draught emanated. The wall I had already deduced was not an exterior one. There, closer now, the scrape, followed by the distinct metallic clink of a chain. The Emperor had not just erased me. He had not just severed me from the institutional memory of the body politic. The sound from beyond the wall was evidence of a different kind of cleansing. My erasure was conceptual, a social and political death. This was a physical one. It was a sound that belonged to the dungeons beneath the old citadel, a place of legend now, a relic of a more brutal era the current emperor's grandfather had publicly condemned and sealed. A political trap for his enemies, now repurposed. There was another. The realization did not bring comfort. It brought a colder, sharper kind of fear. My prison was a gilded cage, designed for a ghost in the machine. This sound spoke of an iron one, built for a body. The Emperor, in his weakness, did not just banish inconvenient truths, he buried them alive. He had not just created a ghost in the machine, he curated a museum of forgotten things. And I was his newest, most prized acquisition. Who was this person? What truth had they embodied that was so dangerous it required not just erasure, but entombment? My mind, a relentless engine of cross-referencing, began to cycle through the ledgers of my memory. The disgraced ministers, the cashiered generals, the court poets whose verses cut too close to the bone. Most were exiled, their names struck from the rolls, their estates seized. They were sent away to wither in obscurity. This was different. This was an active, ongoing suppression. This was a secret kept not just from the public, but from the state itself. I pulled back from the wall, my own predicament snapping into a terrifying new focus. Valerius, now master of the archives, would not be idle. He would be sifting through my work, not for the good of the empire, but for the ghost who had tracked his treason. He would be hunting for anomalies, for the source of the emperor's sudden, albeit temporary, insight. He would find the gaps, the queries I had made. He would hunt me, and if he found me, my fate would not be this quiet, scholarly confinement. It would be the fate I now heard through the wall. The scraping stopped. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before, freighted with this new knowledge. I stood in the center of the room, a prisoner, listening for another prisoner, both of us caught in the same web of imperial fear. Was this person an ally or a warning, a piece of leverage or a glimpse of my own future? They were, above all, data. an unknown quantity, and the archivist in me could not leave an unknown uncatalogued. Action was the only antidote to the paralysis of dread. I began a systematic examination of the wall. It was seamless, the floral damask stretching taut from floor to ceiling. But my fingers, trained to detect the faintest imperfections in vellum and parchment, found it. A hairline seam, almost imperceptible, running vertically behind a tall, ornate bookshelf. It was a door, plastered and papered over, a forgotten entrance to a forgotten cell. My heart beat a heavy, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. This was not a place for shouting. Sound carried in the old stone, and I had no way of knowing what guards, if any, patrolled the outer corridors of this sealed wing. Communication had to be a scalpel, not a hammer. I moved to the wall, away from the hidden door, to a section I judged to be solid stone. I waited, listening to the profound silence for a full minute. Then, using the knuckle of my index finger, I tapped. Not a frantic plea, a pattern, a system. Prime numbers, the most basic, universal sign of a rational mind. It was a call from one intellect to another, a question asked in the pure language of mathematics. Are you there? Are you thinking? Are you like me? I held my breath, pressing my ear to the wall again. The silence stretched. 1 second, 10, 30, a minute, nothing. Despair, cold and familiar, began to seep back into my veins. Perhaps the prisoner was too weak. Perhaps they were mad, lost to the long years in the dark. Perhaps they were already dead, and the sound had been the final settling of a body. I was about to pull away when I heard it. It was not a tap. It was a scratch. Faint, weak, a mouse scrabbling behind a wainscot. But it was deliberate. Skrrr, skrrr. 2. The first prime, a wave of something dizzying and sharp, something akin to victory, washed over me. It was a fragile thread of connection thrown across an abyss of silence and stone. My mind, my only true weapon, had found a purchase. I waited for the next number, for the 3 scratches that would complete the sequence. They did not come, only that pair of faint, insistent marks, followed by silence. It wasn't a failure to understand the pattern. It was a message in itself. The effort was immense. The communication was limited. But it was there. It was real. I was not alone. The knowledge settled not as a comfort, but as a responsibility. My own survival was no longer the only variable in the equation. There was another life hanging in the balance, another truth the Emperor had tried to bury. Valerius was hunting for a ghost. The Emperor was hiding from a general, and here, in the forgotten heart of the palace, a second secret was breathing in the dark. The wall was no longer a boundary. It was a page. The scratches were not just a sound. They were the first entry in a new, secret ledger. The prisoner was the text, and I, the archivist, would decipher him. I would learn his name, his crime, his story. I would add his truth to my own. Valerius thought he had seized the empire's memory when he took the archives. He was wrong. He had only taken the official record, the polished, sanctioned history. The real truths, the inconvenient ones, were alive. They were imprisoned, and they were beginning to communicate. I stood in the silent opulence of my chamber, a stark contrast to the unseen squalor on the other side of the stone, and felt a focus I had not known since my access was denied. The despair was gone, burned away by the cold fire of purpose. The Emperor had erased me from the world, intending to make me a passive, powerless observer. He had failed. He had inadvertently given me a new archive to command. My work had begun again, The sound was a violation. It was a dry, deliberate scrape against stone, a sound that should not exist in the hermetically sealed silence of my tomb. My sequence of taps, a simple declaration of prime numbers, the universal language of logic, had been a message in a bottle thrown into a void. I had not expected the void to answer. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, my ear pressed to the cold stone, the rough texture imprinting on my cheek. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It was no longer an absolute, a constant. It was an interval. It was the space between one sound and the next. The silence now had an edge, a sense of anticipation. It was a clock, reset. I waited. 1 minute, 5. My mind, a frantic machine, spun through possibilities. A rat, cornered and frantic. The settling of the ancient palace, a groan of stone I had mistaken for intent. I was a mind starved of stimulus, fabricating patterns from noise. I was a ghost haunting the architecture of my own confinement, and now I was hearing other ghosts in the walls. Then it came again, a single, distinct scratch. A pause, then another. Scratch. It was a reply, an echo of my own desperate cadence. 2 taps, 2 scratches. My logic was being returned to me, filtered through another consciousness. The silence had been broken, not by a voice, but by a grammar of desperation. My heart, a sluggish organ I had long ignored, began a heavy, painful beat. It was the rhythm of a terrible, nascent hope. Hope was a political liability. It clouded judgment. It was the currency of fools and martyrs, and I had been trained to be neither. I analyzed the sound. It was weak, but controlled. The instrument was crude, a loose stone perhaps, or a sharpened bone. The hand that wielded it was steady. This was not the random scrabbling of a beast or a madman. This was communication. I had a new function. My previous work had been an exercise in macro-analysis, sifting through the sprawling data of an empire. This was the opposite. This was a single, vital data point, a universe contained in a crack in the wall. I abandoned the prime numbers. They were a query, and the query had been answered. Now we needed a lexicon. I pressed my knuckles to the wall, the bones cold against the stone. I tapped 5 times, a slow, deliberate count. Tap, 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 tap. I paused, the silence stretching. Then I tapped once. Tap. I was proposing a system. A grid, the most efficient method for an unknown alphabet. 5 rows, 5 columns, a letter for every coordinate. It was the code of strategists and prisoners, a simple machine for conveying complex thought. It was a test. Could the mind on the other side of the wall follow this leap? Could it build a dictionary with me in the dark? The silence was absolute. A full minute passed. I felt a cold dread crystallize in my gut. I had overshot. I had assumed an intellect that wasn't there, my own arrogance my final companion. I had mistaken a tremor for a handshake. Scratch. A pause, longer this time, as if in concentration. Scratch, 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 scratch. My breath caught. 5 scratches. A longer pause. Scratch. 1 scratch. He understood. He, I felt a certainty it was a he, a baseless but insistent intuition, had mirrored my signal perfectly. He had accepted the premise. We were no longer 2 solitary points of despair. We were collaborators. We were 2 ghosts learning to speak the language of tombs. The process was excruciatingly slow, a conversation born of stone and bone. We spent the first hour building the grid, assigning letters. I would tap the coordinate. He would scratch it back to confirm. It was a painstaking catechism. A 1-1, B 1-2, C 1-3. Each tap, each answering scrape, was a brick laid in the foundation of a new reality. The wall was no longer a barrier. It was a medium, a slate on which we wrote our shared sentence. I did not know his name, his crime, his face. I knew only that his mind worked, that it was logical, and that it was, like mine, trapped. It was enough. When the grid was complete, a silent monument to our shared reason, I hesitated. The first word is a world. It sets the tone for everything that follows. I could ask for his name, I could offer mine, but names were artifacts of a world we had both been erased from. They were labels for bodies, for histories. We were beyond that now. We were pure function, pure intellect. I tapped out a single 3-letter word. The question hung in the stone between us. It was the only question that mattered. It was not a request for a narrative of personal tragedy, but a query into the mechanics of the state. Why were we here? What inconvenient truth did we each represent? The scratching that came in reply was slower, labored. The effort seemed to exhaust him. I pictured a man in chains, his body a wreck, only his mind retaining its structural integrity. The name, scraped into existence from the other side of the wall, landed like a physical blow. Of course, it was always Valerius. The general was not merely building a shadow state, he was curating a shadow prison to house its dissenters. He was the architect of my erasure, and now I knew I was not his first. This dungeon was his private archive, a collection of truths he had personally redacted from the world. My turn. I owed him an answer to my own question. My knuckles were raw, but I barely felt it. The answering silence was different. It was not the silence of waiting or concentration. It was the silence of recognition, of grim, shared understanding. We were two sides of the same coin, minted by the same corrupt hand. His scratching resumed, faster this time, fueled by a new energy. How did I know the general? How had I crossed him? The question was a door, and I had to choose what to show him. The full story was too long, too complex for this crude telegraphy. I needed a single, defining concept. The word took an eternity to tap out. With each letter, I felt the ghost of my old life, the scent of aging paper, the weight of imperial law. It was a lifetime condensed into 9 taps. There was no reply for a long time. I imagined him on the other side, processing this. The archives were the brain of the empire, its institutional memory, and Valerius now controlled the brain. The silence from his side of the wall was the sound of a man calculating the depth of his own damnation. He had been a singular casualty. My presence meant the sickness had spread to the core of the body politic. Finally, the scratching began again. It was just one word, but it was not a word I expected. The word made no sense. It was a non sequitur, a builder's term, a tool for construction. Was his mind failing? Was the strain of communication too much? I tapped back a single character, the universal signifier of incomprehension. The reply came with a terrible, insistent force, each scratch gouging at the stone. I froze, my hand hovering over the wall. Not army, scaffold. My blood ran cold. My entire analysis, the one that had cost me my freedom and my name, had been predicated on a single assumption, that Valerius was building a secret army to mount a conventional coup. I had seen the diverted funds, the weapons requisitions, the ghost payrolls for soldiers who did not exist. I saw an army, but I was wrong. A scaffold is not the building. It is the structure that allows the building to be made. It is temporary. It is a tool for replacement. Valerius wasn't building a second army to fight the first. He was building a scaffold around the existing state, piece by piece, agency by agency. He was using the empire's own resources to construct a framework, and when it was complete, he would simply remove the old structure, the emperor, the courts, the law, leaving his new one standing in its place. It wasn't a coup. It was a replacement, a demolition from within. The man in the next cell had not given me a piece of information. He had given me a new metaphor, a new lens through which to see the truth. And with that single word, he revealed that my meticulous work, the proof I had nearly died to deliver, was incomplete. I had seen the weapon, but I had fundamentally misunderstood how it was to be used. The emperor's fear was justified, but his understanding was as flawed as mine. He thought he was fighting a wolf at the door. He did not realize the house itself was being eaten from the inside out. Who was this man? What function had he served to have seen this truth so clearly, so long ago? I had to ask. My fingers trembled as I tapped out the question. The scratching that followed was faint, weary, as if the effort of this revelation had cost him everything. Each letter was a struggle. It was a name I had read once in a sealed file from the reign of the emperor's father. A name that had been officially erased 30 years ago, attached to a project that was declared a catastrophic failure. A name that belonged to a ghost. The Imperial architect, the man who designed the capital's unbreachable defenses, the man who built the very walls that now imprisoned us both.